He is honored with monuments, documentaries, and films are made about him at the expense of the state budget. Admiral Alexander Kolchak has been one of the main figures of various commemorative events of pro-monarchist activists throughout Russia for many years. A monument was erected to him in Irkutsk in 2004, and recently on February 7th, Alexander Kolchak's Memorial Day began to be celebrated with wide media coverage. All this is happening despite the fact that from the point of view of modern legislation, Kolchak is a war criminal. In 1999, the military court of the Russian Transbaikal military district issued a ruling according to which Alexander Kolchak is not subject to rehabilitation since his participation in mass political repression was proven. They tried to appeal the ruling to the military collegium of the Supreme Court, which concluded that there was no grounds to cancel the decision. All this does not prevent certain public circles, with the support and often on the initiative of government representatives, from creating the image of the hero of Russia for Kolchak. He is called a true patriot, the savior of Russia, a true Russian white knight, and the last missed chance of the country in opposing the Bolshevik chaos. Today we will touch on only one side of the story of the White Admiral Alexander Kolchak and answer the question, was Kolchak really a patriot of Russia? First of all, we would like to give the floor to the main witness whose testimony can shed light on the issue. We will give excerpts from the protocols Kolchak's interrogation, compiled in January through February 1920 by the Extraordinary Commission of Inquiry to investigate the activities of the White Guard Admiral. The commission conducted its work in Irkutsk until the execution of Kolchak on February 7, 1920. The originals of the protocols are kept in the State Archive of the Russian Federation. In the record of the protocol of February 27, 1920, Kolchak testifies to how he established business contact with the representative of the Entente in Russia, the American Admiral Glennon, after the February Revolution of 1917. Admiral Glennon lived in the Winter Palace. There I was, received by Root and Admiral Glennon. Glennon informed me that the purpose of his mission is to make a visit to our fleet. Then the American government is interested in some issues on mine action and the fight against submarines and would like to get acquainted with it. In addition, he informed me in top secret that in America, there is an assumption to take active actions of the American fleet in the Mediterranean Sea against the Turks and the Dardanelles. Knowing that I was engaged in similar operations, Admiral Glennon told me that it would be desirable for me to give all the information on the issue of amphibious operations in the Bosphorus. I replied that I did not give up on this and was ready to share the information that I had. Then Glennon asked me, how would you react if I asked the government to send you to America, since familiarization with this issue will take a long time, and meanwhile, we have to leave in a few days. Regarding this amphibious operation, he asked me not to say anything to anyone, and not to report it even to the government. I told him that I had nothing against being sent to America, that I was currently free, and had not found any use for myself yet. Therefore, if the government agreed to send me, I will not object. Shortly after that, in connection with Kerensky's arrival, there was a positive decision on my trip to America. I was visited by familiar officers, mainly Navy officers, who begged me to stay in the Navy and not leave. I said that I had already made a certain commitment, and that there was no use of my forces in Russia now. At one time, I wanted to go to the front to be appointed to command a heavy battery, but after the shameful offensive on the southwestern front on June 18th, I decided to abandon this idea. Then the politicians who sat in the Tauride Palace, with whom I was familiar from the State Duma, having learned about my arrival, they invited me. I came and told them about my situation. They also told me not to leave, that I was needed here. I said that I was ready to go anywhere and do anything, but let them tell me definitely what I should do, that I do not receive such instructions, and the situation which I could find myself if I stayed in Russia is such that it excludes the possibility of any useful work for the homeland. Then I was at several more meetings of the National Center, which was formed at that time. There I also said that I could no longer work here since I had already made a certain commitment to the American government, and I was only waiting for the issuance of a foreign passport to go to America with the mission entrusted to me by the government. Alexeyevsky, a member of the investigative commission, pointed out to Kolchak during the interrogation that the flight of officers abroad in the summer and autumn of 1917 was perceived by soldiers and sailors as a national betrayal. Alexeyevsky Have you ever had a thought that would justify these reproaches, namely, the thought that the departure of major representatives of the command staff from responsible posts, for example, your departure from the post of commander of the Black Sea Fleet, is sabotage of the military force, whose disposal passed into other hands? Have you ever thought that by your departure you are weakening the remaining military force of the state in the form of the Black Sea Fleet, which was under your leadership? Kolchak: No, I didn't have that thought. I thought I was doing what my conscience and duty told me to do. I couldn't stay in the Navy since I was removed. Alexeyevsky: You left the command without an order. Kolchak: But I was put in such a position that I could no longer command. I did what I had to do and thought I couldn't do anything else. What else could I do? Go to further disgrace to ensure that my orders were not obeyed? I remained at my post until I was removed. When I was forced to leave, the government did not react to it in any way. I was in Petrograd for 1 to 1.5 months, and the government did not make any proposals to me. Apparently, it itself considered it impossible. As for my departure to America, it was in close connection with the consent of the British government to give me the opportunity to pass through England, since at the time, the British established their control at the border points. The British controlled the departure from Russia of those persons who passed through these points. Therefore, I entered into relations with the British mission, told them frankly about the purpose of my trip, and they told me that it would be better if I left Russia under a false name, in view of the fact that the Germans were watching me, and if they became aware of my departure, they will take measures. After the 20th of July, I left Petrograd, having received notification from the British mission that I had to leave at that time. I left with the mission by rail around the 20th. The British were aware of my trip and my mission. I was traveling through Sweden under a false name. The attitude towards me was the most kind. From Bergen, we went to London, from where we were supposed to travel across the Atlantic Ocean to America. I was in London at the beginning of August. There I saw only naval figures. I was with Admiral Jellicoe, who at that time was the Minister of the Navy, the First Lord of the Admiralty. I was several times with the Chief of the Naval General Staff, General Hull. I left Glasgow for Halifax. The British, thanks to my personal acquaintance with Admiral Jellicoe and General Hull, were extremely kind to me. Their courtesy was expressed in the fact that we were placed on this armed cruiser for free. Upon arrival in Halifax, we were met by a naval officer, Marine Agent McStuff, who told us that the representatives of the United States Maritime Ministry would meet us in Montreal, that we had been provided with a special carriage, that we were guests of the American nation, and that we should not worry about either the premises or the means of transportation, since all this is taken over by the American government. Thus we arrived at Montreal, where we were served a carriage. Representatives of the Maritime Ministry of the States also arrived there, 2 officers who were seconded to my mission and who had previously been in Russia. Thus we arrived in New York and Washington with complete comfort. Upon arrival in Washington, I paid first of all a visit to our ambassador Bakhmetiev and the Minister of the Sea, his assistant, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Minister of War, in a word, to all those persons with whom I later had to deal. Just as in England, I enjoyed the fullest attention here from the American, mainly maritime authorities. After it became clear what kind of work I needed to do and how to use the materials brought to me, I was asked to go to New York together with my mission, not far from which is the Maritime Academy. It was agreed with the minister that we would go to New York together with the seconded officers, where we would analyze all the materials, where we would be told what the state's maritime department was interested in. We went to New York and studied there for 2 or 3 weeks. From America, I decided to go to European Russia, report my trip to the government, and then start doing something. Just on the day of my departure, the first information was received about the Bolshevik coup on October 26th, that Kerensky had fled, the government had fallen, and Petrograd was in the hands of the Soviets. We arrived in Yokohama around November 8th through 9th. Here I was brought up to date with events and received the first information about the state of affairs in Russia. Soon after that, the news about the negotiations in the Brest Peace came out. It was the hardest blow for me, maybe even worse than in the Black Sea Fleet. I saw that all the work of my life ended exactly as I feared, and against which I most definitely worked all my life. After considering this question, I came to the conclusion that there is only one thing left for me: to continue the war as a representative of the former Russian government, which gave a certain commitment to the Allies. I occupied an official position, enjoyed its trust. It waged this war, and I'm obliged to continue this war. Then I went to the British envoy in Tokyo, Sir Green, and expressed to him my point of view on the situation, saying that I do not recognize this government and consider it my duty, as one of the representatives of the former government, to fulfill the promise to the Allies that the obligations of Russia had assumed towards the Allies are also my obligations, as a representative of the Russian command, and that is why I consider it necessary to fulfill these obligations to the end, and I wish to participate in the war, even if Russia concluded peace under the Bolsheviks. Therefore, I turned to him with a request to inform the English government that I asked to be accepted into the British Army on any conditions. I do not set any conditions, but only ask you to give me the opportunity to actively fight. Sir Green listened to me and said, "I fully understand you. I understand your situation. I will inform my government about this and ask you to wait for an answer from the English government." Alexeyevsky, at the time when you made such a difficult decision to enlist in the service of another state, even if it was an allied or former allied one, you should have had the idea that there is a whole group of officers who quite consciously remain in the service of the new government in the Navy, and that among them there are well-known figures. How did you view them then? Kolchak, I thought they were doing the wrong thing. They shouldn't have stayed in the service. I could not, of course, regard them all as dishonest people. After all, most of them are put in a hopeless situation. They had to eat something. 2 weeks later, a reply came from the British Ministry of War. I was first informed that the British government readily accepts my offer to enlist in the army and asks me where I would prefer to serve. I replied that by asking them to accept me for service in the British Army, I did not set any conditions and offered to use me as it finds possible. Thus, at the request of the British War Ministry, I replied that I had no complaints or desires, except for one thing: the opportunity to participate actively in the war. Finally, very late, the answer came that the British government offered me to go to Bombay and report to the headquarters of the Indian Army, where I would receive instructions about my appointment to the Mesopotamian front. For me, this, although I did not ask for it, was quite acceptable, since it was near the Black Sea, where actions against the Turks took place and where I was fighting at sea. Therefore, I willingly accepted the offer and asked Sir Green to give me the opportunity to take the steamer to Bombay. At the next interrogation on February 28th, Kolchak tells in detail how instead of the fronts of World War I, he ended up in the far east of Russia. Kolchak was brought from Yokohama to Shanghai, where through the mediation of emigrant Prince Kudashchev, representatives of the Entente made him an offer to join the board of the Commercial Society of the Chinese Eastern Railway. Kolchak, as a military specialist, had to provide military cover for the activities of this enterprise. I left Shanghai by boat for Singapore. In Singapore, the commander of the troops, General Ridout, came to greet me, handed me an urgent telegram sent to Singapore from the director of the Intelligence Department of the Information Department of the Military General Staff in England. This telegram read as follows: the British government accepted my proposal. However, due to the changed situation on the Mesopotamian front, considers in view of the requests addressed to it by our envoy, Kudashchev, it is useful for the common Allied cause that I return to Russia, that I am recommended to go to the Far East to start my activities there, and this, from their point of view, is more profitable than my stay on the Mesopotamian front, especially since the situation there has completely changed. I've already done more than half of the way. This put me in an extremely difficult situation, primarily material. I then sent another telegram with a request. Is this an order or just a piece of advice that I may not comply with? To this, an urgent telegram was received with a rather vague answer. The British government insists that it is better for me to go to the Far East and recommends that I go to Beijing at the disposal of our envoy Kudashchev. Then I saw that the issue had been resolved. After waiting for the first steamer, I left for Shanghai and from Shanghai by rail to Beijing. It was in March or April 1918. Kolchak, as a highly qualified military specialist, had to be responsible for the security of the commercial interests of Russian and foreign entrepreneurs on the Chinese Eastern Railway. Such, according to the White Admiral himself, was the task assigned to him by the British government. However, in fact, the representatives of the Entente had other, much more serious plans for the former naval commander. Alexander Kolchak confirms in his testimony he did not hesitate long to accept the abdication of Nicholas II, and then, being in the service of the provisional government, left Russia without official permission and entered the service of Britain. Kolchak, according to him, was eager to go to the front of the World War, but for some reason the admiral ignored all the proposals of the provisional government to send him to the front. As a result, the ardent supporter of the war to the bitter end was recruited by agents of Britain, USA, and France and ended up among the directors of a commercial firm. What did this patriot do next? In June 1918, a mutiny of 40,000 Czechoslovak troops broke out in Russia. This mutiny was prepared in advance by the governments of the Entente countries. The direct initiator was British Prime Minister Lloyd George. It was the Czech legionnaires who initially became the mainstay of the anti-Bolshevik government in Siberia and the Far East. Formally, the rebels were subordinate to the coalition of government of the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, the so-called Directory, first located in Ufa and then in Omsk. In November 1918, Kolchak arrived in Omsk in the carriage of the British General Knox as a military specialist, but soon, with the patronage of foreign generals, Kolchak's men overthrew the Directory, arresting and killing its members. The Kolchak coup took place on the night of November 17 through 18, 1918. The representatives of the Entente, who were with the Czechoslovaks, did not prevent the coup, since they themselves were its organizers and instigators. Thus, the armed force of the Czechs, under the direct control of the Entente generals, as well as the diplomatic and financial assistance of the British, American, and French politicians, opened the way for Kolchak to the post of the supreme ruler of Russia. The Entente countries, during the Civil War, provided Kolchak with constant support. By March 1919, the US government, for example, transferred 200,000 rifles, 100 machine guns, 22 guns, 4.7 million rounds of ammunition, and many other military equipment to the Kolchak armies. During 1919, Kolchak received 392,994 rifles and more than 15 million rounds of ammunition from the United States alone. In July 1919, by personal order of the American President Wilson, 12,000 Colt revolvers and 1 million cartridges for them, 268,000 three-line rifles and 15 million cartridges for them were transferred to Kolchak's troops. The Americans supplied Kolchak with equipment, military equipment, and materials. The US authorities handed over 100 airplanes, about 400 trucks and cars of the Army of the Supreme Ruler. American Standard Oil provided Kolchak's fleet with oil. The United Kingdom was also engaged in supplying the Kolchak army, in whose service the white dictator Kolchak officially served. Since the end of 1918, the British have handed over 200,000 overcoats, 200,000 hats, 200,000 jackets, 400,000 pairs of shoes, 400,000 blankets, and other uniforms and equipment to Kolchak's army. The British supplied Kolchak with about 100,000 rifles and more than 200,000 machine guns, dozens of tanks and guns, 3,000 telephones, and much more. Winston Churchill, who held the post of Minister of War in the British government at that time, reported that the total amount of military cargo sent by the British to Siberia was about 100,000 tons. Other states also helped the Kolchak army. Aid continued to arrive throughout 1919. The relevant documents and data on this have been published for a long time and are in the public domain. In addition to the supply of weapons, equipment, and materials, the Entente countries provided Kolchak with extensive financial support. The UK alone provided the Kolchak government with loans worth £50 million sterling, a gigantic sum at the time. Foreign governments were not limited to material assistance to Kolchak. The very existence of the Kolchak regime from the very beginning would have been impossible without support in the form of foreign armed formations. The main forces of the White Guards in the east of the country were originally Czechoslovaks. The number of Belgic corps reached about 42,000 soldiers. In addition, up to 1,000 British and up to 9,000 American soldiers provided direct military assistance to Kolchak in Siberia and the Far East. Japan's military presence was especially numerous, up to 150,000 people by 1920. Foreign troops mainly served in the rear, fought with the partisans, suppressed by force any discontent of the local population. Naturally, loans, weapons, and the participation of foreign soldiers in the Civil War in Russia All this was not presented to Kolchak on a gratuitous basis. The White Admiral generously paid for the help of foreign partners with the gold reserves of Russia captured by him in Kazan, as well as other valuables. According to the testimony of the White Guard General Baron Alexei Budberg, the Czechoslovaks alone carried about 600 wagons of looted property with them during the evacuation: valuable metals, machine tools and equipment, art objects, and other valuables. According to their own calculations, the price of the gold reserves seized by the Kolchakists was the sum of 661,535,834 rubles. According to various estimates, Kolchak spent between 215 to 235.5 million rubles in less than 2 years. Most of the valuables went to foreign partners to pay for military supplies to supply the army. Moreover, gold was sold abroad at an undervalued rate, which contributed to the rapid enrichment of foreign suppliers. Taking into account the total corruption in the Kolchak government, as numerous testimonies of the White Guards themselves have been preserved, it can be argued that a significant part of the gold reserve was stolen by the leaders of the Kolchak regime and the entrepreneurs surrounding them. In addition to the general plunder and the direct export of valuables from the country to pay for military assistance, Kolchak's foreign partners counted on other benefits and preferences in the event of a victorious end to the civil war in Russia. British, French, American, and Japanese large firms were to receive the right to exploit the resources of Russia, the right to long-term lease on preferential terms to the country's largest enterprises. Especially ambitious in this regard were the claims of Japan, which provided the largest military presence of foreign interventionists. The Japanese planned not only to achieve special conditions for doing business in Russia, but also intended to achieve territorial acquisitions at the expense of Russian lands in the Far East. Representatives of the Kolchak regime knew about this, but continued to cooperate with foreign occupiers. Here are examples of the relevant documentary evidence. From the summary of information of Kolchak's general staff on the main directions of Japan's foreign policy in the Far East on April 30th, 1919. For rendering real assistance to the resurgent Russia, Japan, presumably, expects to legally be able to use the riches of our Far East, both by territorial acquisition, the second half of Sakhalin Island, and by obtaining concessions and privileges. A telegram from Kolchak's military representative in Japan to the Chief of Staff of the Supreme Commander of the Siberian Army, General Lebedev, about Japanese compensation plans for assistance to the White Guards on December 28, 1918. I learned the following information from a serious American source. Japan intends to present as compensation for the assistance provided to Russia: 1. Vladivostok as a free port; 2. Free trade and navigation on the Sungarian Namor; 3. Control over the Siberian Railway and the transfer of the Changchun Harbin section to Japan; 4. Fishing rights in the entire Far East; 5. Sale of northern Sakhalin to Japan. All the evidence, data, and materials provided by us are widely known. All sorts of documents and memoirs of participants in the events, both from the red and the white side, have been published for a long time and are widely available. Kolchak, despite the opinion of some engaged citizens and their sponsors, was not a patriot of Russia, much less a hero. The facts show that he left his country during the years of ordeal and joined the service of a foreign government. He swore allegiance to the British Crown. It was on the instructions of this foreign curators that Kolchak headed the White Guard dictatorial regime. With the direct support of the Entente countries and their allies, he unleashed a new stage of the fratricidal war in Russia. Accepting military and material assistance from foreign countries, Kolchak not only squandered the values that made up the national treasure of the country, but was also ready to give up part of the territories and make resources, enterprises, and the population of Russia dependent on foreign firms. Kolchak was a traitor who faithfully served the commercial and political interests of his foreign masters. He did not hesitate to shed rivers of blood so that speculators and bankers could continue to feast at the expense of the working population of the country. The praise of Kolchak is the praise of the military dictatorship, behind which there is big business focused on plundering the country's wealth. History is being rewritten for the sake of manipulations in the present and the future. Stay tuned.